Good evening. I'm here this evening to talk with you about a little presentation that I call Moonlighting, Al Huenke on Baseball's Field of Dreams. My name is Mike Lackey. You might have seen a movie called Field of Dreams, and if you did, you might remember a character in that movie by the name of Archie Graham. He was an ambitious, earnest, enthusiastic young ball player who later in life became a physician in a small town in Minnesota. What you may not realize is that Archie Graham was a real person. He practiced medicine in a little town called Chisholm, Minnesota for about 60 years before his death in 1965. In baseball, he was sometimes known as Moonlight Graham. We don't really know where that nickname came from, but in baseball he's famous, and he is famous, oddly enough, because of the movie and because of the novel that he was based on. He's famous for having actually one of the shortest Major League Baseball careers on record. On June 29th, 1905, he played 2 innings in right field for the New York Giants. That was the total extent of his Major League career. Well, I'm here to talk to you about a fellow who had a similar career. Al Huenke is his name, and you might think of him as Auglaize County's Moonlight Graham. Nobody ever wrote a book or made a movie about Al Huenke, so he never became famous, but there are some definite parallels between his career and Archie Graham's. Like Graham, Al Huenke played for the New York Giants and for manager John McGraw back during what baseball calls its dead ball era. And like Graham, Huenke's bid for big league stardom turned out to be just the merest glimmer, a fraction of one game. Albert Alfred Huenke was born June 26, 1891, near New Bremen. He was among 9 children of Albert and Minnie Jordan Huenke, who were Ohio-born parents of German immigrants. Working on the family farm during the spring planting and the fall harvest probably impeded Al's education somewhat, but he did graduate from New Bremen High School in 1911, just a few weeks before his 20th birthday. By that time, Auglaize County had become something of a baseball hotbed. Between, say, the 1890s and the onset of World War I, Auglaize County, which only had about 31,000 people at that time, nurtured more than a half a dozen ball players who eventually reached the major leagues. The 2 most prominent of them, you may be familiar with Bob Ewing, who was born in New Hampshire and who pitched in the National League from 1902 to 1912, mostly with the Cincinnati Reds. The other fellow who attained real prominence was Miller Huggins, who played for a semi-pro team in Wapakoneta in 1898. Huggins had a very respectable playing career, but he achieved real greatness in the 1920s as manager of the New York Yankees when they had the Babe Ruth and that whole Murderers Row outfit. He won 6 pennants and 3 World Series and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1964. Well, in Huenke's case, soon after he graduated from high school, he was developing a reputation as a ball player himself. Several local newspapers referred to him as New Bremen's strikeout wonder. He was a pitcher, of course. His actual beginnings in professional baseball are somewhat uncertain. We don't know exactly where and when he started out. He was still pitching for the New Bremen town team as late as September 1912. And a contract card that's on file at the Baseball Hall of Fame says he signed his first professional contract in 1913 with the Dallas Giants of the Texas League. Now, that seems a little bit unlikely. The Texas League was classified as a Class B league at that time, which is about halfway up the ladder of the minor leagues. And it seems kind of unlikely that a Class B team in Dallas would pluck a green as grass pitcher out of the Ohio cornfields 850 miles away and sign him to a contract. When he reached Dallas the following spring, they considered him to be a promising prospect because of, quote, his wonderful record in the O&P League last year. Now, this is probably the most likely possibility. There were reports in the local newspapers that other teams were interested. At one point, it was said that he had signed with Lima in the Ohio State League. On the same day, a Lima paper reported that he had turned down that offer and was hoping to catch on with Dayton in the Central League, but he never apparently played for either of those teams. The O&P League was the Ohio-Pennsylvania League. It was a Class C league that had teams in towns like Steubenville and East Liverpool and McKeesport, Pennsylvania. The trouble with that is that the O&P that year, 1912, had a really chaotic season where half of the teams went out of business in the middle of the season. The other half started in one town and moved to other towns, and apparently no records were ever compiled. So we don't really have documentation. But again, late in 1912, a Salina paper mentioned that Huenke had, quote, made a professional record that year. So he pitched somewhere that season, probably the O&P. In any case, by the time he reached Dallas the next year, he was 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, right-handed pitcher. He was known in New Bremen for reasons I do not understand as Mac, and he was sometimes referred to in the sporting press as Happy Huenke. He produced an 8-10 record his first year with Dallas. Highlights included a 5-1 victory over the Beaumont Oilers, in which he gave up just one hit. By early 1914, he was attracting attention from major league teams, and in fact, he probably did some of the best pitching of his life during spring training in 1914. He pitched 4 innings of a 4-0 victory over the New York Giants and the great Christy Mathewson, allowing just one hit while striking out 5. He faced the Giants again a week later, struck out 7, and left the game leading 2-0 after 6 innings. The Giants did eventually win the game, but that wasn't his fault. He also pitched a complete game victory that spring against the Pittsburgh Pirates. So midway through the summer of 1914, he was on his way to a 16-11 record for Dallas, and it was reported that the New York Giants had purchased his contract with the idea that he would join the Giants at the end of the season. And a local weekly in New Bremen published sort of your typical local boy makes good article. Let me read this to you. It says, "Friends here of Albert, or more commonly known as Al Huenke, will no doubt be pleased to hear of his recent jump into the limelight by casting his lot with the New York Giants. Al has pitched many games in this vicinity, and we guess that if he can stand up against such sluggers as Dave Simpson and Jig Sullivan, he won't have much trouble in the National League." They then added, "New Bremen people always stick by their native sons, and everyone here hopes he will succeed. You know us, Al." This last was probably a wink in the direction of Ring Lardner, who had published just a few weeks earlier the first of his short stories, which were framed as letters home from a fictitious pitcher named Jack Keith, and the letters were later published in book form as You Know Me, Al. The St. Mary's Evening Leader was equally optimistic about Huenke's prospects, thanks to his, quote, world of speed and large assortments of breakers, all governed by a cool head. In one of his last outings, the strikeout wonder struck out 14 batters in a 12-inning 2-1 victory over Beaumont. Now, when he reached New York, the Giants and their fans were in sort of a glum mood. They had won 3 straight National League pennants from 1911 to 1913, and had won at least 90 games 6 years in a row. But in 1914, they had fallen off and were sort of limping toward the end of the season. They would end up winning just 84 games and finishing 10.5 games out of first place. So they were really just sort of playing out the string. Huenke finally got a chance to pitch on October 6th, 1914. It was the second game of a Tuesday afternoon doubleheader at the Polo Grounds. Was the last game of the season. Now, while they were playing the Philadelphia Phillies, and the Phillies stuck with their regular lineup that day, but the Giants used the day mainly to audition young players, and they kind of played it as a lark. They used 15 players in the doubleheader, 5 of whom made their major league debuts that year. And here I have to beg your indulgence for a little aside. As an old newspaper guy, I was interested in studying this out to find that, frankly, there was probably more talent in the press box that day than there was on the field. New York, of course, this was the heyday of newspapers, before radio, before television. At least 7 New York dailies covered these games. And we can't identify all of the reporters because some of the papers did not give bylines at that time yet. But among the guys we know were covering it were Sam Crane, who had been a major league infielder back in the 80s and was a New York sports writer for the last 35 years of his life, and Joe Vila from the New York Sun, who was a very prominent New York sports writer for 40 years, a guy of national influence, and a young kid named Fred Lieb, who was, I think, about 22 years old at the time, just starting out on a career. He would end up writing about baseball for more than 70 years. In addition to that fairly impressive collection of sports writers, there were at least 2 legitimate literary figures in the press box that day. One was Haywood Broun, working for the New York Tribune. The other was Damon Runyon, working for the New York American. Those names might or might not be familiar, I don't know. Broun later became a nationally known columnist and a founding member of the famous Algonquin Hotel Roundtable of legendary wits that included the writer Dorothy Parker, playwright George S. Kaufman, humorist Robert Benchley, and the critic Alexander Wolcott. Runyon, of course, became a very famous short story writer, and characters that he created became the basis of the Broadway musical Guys and Dolls. When Huenke finally took the mound, his supporting cast was made up of what Runyon classified as wholly anonymous young men. There were a couple that were making their major league debuts that day, a couple of others who were also rookies but who were actually closing out what turned out to be very brief big league careers. The left fielder was a guy who had an odd career. He had spent the whole season with the Giants, but that they had rarely used him for anything but a pinch runner. And in center field, one of the guys who wasn't entirely obscure was the former Olympian Jim Thorpe. So Huenke goes in the 6th inning. By this time the Giants have made 6 errors and are trailing the game 7-0. It's pretty much a blowout. And as I say, the Giants weren't taking it particularly seriously. The manager, McGraw, actually took the day off and turned over the managing duties to an outfielder, Mike Donnelly, although apparently McGraw was in the ballpark, probably observing in civilian clothes. The Giants appeared on the field in their road uniforms, which were gray with purple trim. Their white uniforms had been sent to the dry cleaners because they were getting ready to play a postseason exhibition series with the New York Yankees, and they wanted to look their best for that. Anyway, Huenke retired the first batter that he faced. The second batter singled and stole second base. He retired the third guy, but then Gabby Cravath, Philadelphia's right fielder, who was a very good hitter, came up and hit a single to knock in the runner from second base. That was the end of the scoring in the game. The Giants lost it 8-0. Huenke retired the last guy that inning and got out of the inning. In the bottom of the sixth, Huenke managed to accomplish one thing that Moonlight Graham never did, which was that he actually went to bat in a major league game. He flied out to center field against a left-hander named Stan Baumgartner, who also later became a fairly prominent sports writer, as a matter of fact. The Giants failed to score in that inning despite getting a couple of base hits. In the seventh, Huenke struck out the first two batters he faced and retired the third on a ground ball. The Giants went out in order in their half of the inning, the third out coming on Red Murray's fly ball to right field. At that point, the home plate umpire, a young man named Arthur O'Connor, who was another rookie who was actually working the last game of his brief career as a major league umpire, turned to the grandstand, which by this time was mostly empty. The crowd had been reported at, quote, a few thousand at most, and by this point in the afternoon, most of those people had gone home. But O'Connor, in any case, turns to the stands and announces that the game was being called on account of darkness, thus ending both the season and, as it turned out, Huenke's career, as Haywood Broun put it, 2 full innings before their allotted time. The New York Tribune prosaically described dust falling over the Polo Grounds just as Red Murray's fly ball settled into Cravath's mitt, but there's actually some doubt about that. Both the Sun and the Times reported that the sun was still, quote, shining brightly. All the reporters seemed to agree, though, and I think that everybody concerned, the ball players, the fans, the writers themselves, seemed relieved to see the season end. It'd been a tough season for the Giants after their high expectations, and as Sam Crane put it, there was no hurrah about it, just a falling of the draperies that shut out the agonizing remembrances. Damon Runyon in the New York American stated that the spectators were, quote, kindly requested to use the exit nearest them and to refrain from casting asparagus on the performers. Not surprisingly, commentary on Huenke's work was scanty. The Philadelphia Record said the doubleheader was hardly taken seriously even by the players, and that the second game was even more of a joke than the first, although the writer did concede that Huenke had done better than the Giants' starting pitcher, who was another major league debut by a fellow. He was born in Sweden. His name was Eric Eriksson, and he did last a few years in the big leagues eventually. But beyond that, as the New York Times put it, the less said about the second game, the better. Now, the Giants kept Huenke, and he went to spring training with them the following year, and reportedly pitched well in the South. They were, I believe they were in Texas again, but shortly before the season started, they optioned him to Rochester in the International League, back in the minors. As it turned out, he pitched only 2 more seasons. That year, 1915 and 1916. In the final weeks of his career, he pitched 2 complete games in a doubleheader at Utica, losing the first 1-0 and winning the second 2-0, allowing only 3 hits in each game. He also beat Syracuse with a 7-inning 1-hitter. After retiring from baseball, he returned to New Bremen and ran a farm with his brother William. Now, back in 1916, Huenke had married Elsie Berend, who was a German immigrant. They had 2 daughters and remained married for 52 years until her death in 1968. In New Bremen, Huenke coached baseball and promoted youth baseball, was a well-known person around town. He ran for county commissioner in 1940 as a Republican, and he was re-elected again in 1944 for a second four-year term. Al Huenke died at Joint Township Memorial Hospital in St. Mary's on September 20th, 1974 of metastatic colon cancer. He was buried in New Bremen's German Protestant cemetery. The St. Mary's Evening Leader played his obituary on the front page under a two-column headline that mentioned his baseball career in the first paragraph, didn't mention his time on the county commission at all. The headline said, "Former Major Leaguer Albert Huenke dies." Thank you.